What's up guys, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. This has been a highly requested video, and for good reason. There are a bunch of ways to make full songs on the Roland MC-101, and not all of them are completely obvious, but a lot of them are pretty easy, and that's even more the case with the recently-ish released 1.7 update. I'm going to get into all that in a second. I do want to mention I'm not really going to get into the post-production process, like mixing and mastering. I did a dedicated video on that I'll link at the end of this video. But with that out of the way, let's start things off with what is probably the most straightforward way to develop an idea into a full track on this thing, and that is live jamming. This is what this was really built for, and they've expanded it a bunch, and I'll get into that in a bit. There are a few things that we can do to build up a live jam. First of all, there's just simple muting and unmuting, and you can also do that with these sliders, which is not necessary, but is definitely fun. We've also got stuff like filter cutoffs at our fingertips, and this is great for bringing an element in slowly along with volume, or just building up an energy level over time. And we've got clips. A bunch of different stuff lives on a clip-by-clip basis. The problem is, to get to different clips for different tracks, you have to toggle each track and then select stuff. That can get a bit cumbersome in the context of a live jam, which is why we have scenes. You can get to those either by holding down clip, and that'll just bring that window up temporarily, or you hit clip and then sequence, and that'll bring this up without it going away immediately. So I've got a couple different scenes set up here. This one you've already heard. And you might have noticed that the bass track changed its sound between these two. I'll get to that in a second. And if I want to start a new scene, I just grab an empty one. And then I can go through each track and assign clips to it, or not assign clips to it if I want something to not be playing in a certain scene. I don't have a ton of stuff in this project, but hopefully you get the idea. And then to save that, I go back to my clip window and just hold that down until it stores the scene, and that's good to go. That I can recall whenever I want to. That's super nice to have, and of course I can bring in scatter whenever I want as well for some more kind of on-the-fly effects. And don't forget, you've got the USB multi-track audio out, so as you do a live jam, and maybe even film it to have kind of a built-in music video, you can also record those individual tracks as you jam, mix those in post. I, once again, did an entire video on that. That'll be linked at the end of this video. But let's get into briefly how to have sounds change on a clip-by-clip basis, because that's something that's incredibly powerful, and we're going to see just how powerful that can be in a second. And I should also mention that there has been an update that makes scenes even more powerful than they used to be, and I'll get into that in a little bit as well. So for the bass track, which I've got isolated here, I've got two different patches living on two different clips. By default, the track will control which patch you have, and that'll apply to all the clips. But you can change that. So I've got this saw patch here. So if I want the sound to change on a clip-by-clip basis, what I have to do is change how the track deals with presets. So I go to Shift, select the track that I want to select, and you change your sound source to clip. By default, it's set to track. Change it to clip. Be aware that this will erase whatever preset was living in the track previously, so you'll either have to recall that or do this from the very beginning. But once you've done that, anytime you go and change a preset in any clip, that preset will live only on that clip. And if you want to have the same preset over multiple clips, you can just duplicate the clip, erase all the notes, and go from there. That's how I'd recommend going about it, and that can become incredibly useful, especially because of the somewhat limited track count on this thing. I mentioned that scenes have gotten even more useful and powerful, so let's go into that next, and this is something that was newly introduced in the 1.7 update. They added Scene Chain, It's not a full song mode. I think they've been kind of hesitant to call it a proper song mode, but it can definitely get you into that territory. So let me show you how that works next. It might seem slightly convoluted, and that's probably because they had to figure out a way to integrate it after the fact, after the user interface was already designed, but it's really not too bad. So in order to get that going, you go into your scene, so Shift Scene, and you've got a few things that you can deal with here. First of all, you've got chain. I'm going to turn that on. And then the length is how long that scene is going to go on for before it changes. So if you have it set to off, I believe it will just run through the entire thing and then move on to the next one. Or you can have more fine control over that. So let me just set it to 1 bar to show you what that sounds like. So let me select that. It ran for 1 bar and then went immediately to the next one. I believe these do have to be in order, so bear that in mind. Let me go back to this one, though. I can set it to the actual length of the pattern, and if I go beyond that, it'll just loop it. So if I want a section of a song to repeat itself, I just set that to, say, 32 bars, and it'll repeat, 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 until it finally moves on to the next section of the song. And I can do this for each section until I've got a nice chain going, and that'll make for less margin for error as you go and build up an entire arrangement. And that means that you can do it once and not have to do it again. So as you build up a track, keep making scenes and keep going through this chaining process. And then once again, you can record the output, maybe tweak some parameters on the fly and go from there. And I should also mention, you've got multiple banks of scenes to work with. You're not limited to just these. You don't necessarily have to use scene chain to build up an entire arrangement either. One thing that I've been doing kind of via jamming, and this would make that even easier, is to build up a bunch of layers that would go well together. Even though I've only got 4 tracks, nothing's stopping me from coming up with some extra synth parts, maybe even some extra drum or percussion parts that would layer well together, and having them all stored within clips and having sounds controlled on a clip-by-clip basis. Then what I can do is just cycle through all of the elements, record the individual tracks, and then separate that stuff out in my DAW after the fact, layer all the elements on top of each other, and then build up an arrangement, which can be quicker in a DAW. I did get a comment asking me if that process kind of slows me down a bit. For me personally, it doesn't. Getting those extra layers can often make building up a full arrangement easier because I've just got more to work with, and arranging a track in a DAW is often just quicker for me. A few pro tips for making that process as easy and painless as possible. For one thing, I would do all of that in one continuous take. That way, all you have to do in post to get it to line up to your DAW's grid is just grab the first transient of your first drum track, line that up to the grid, just snap it there, and then everything will be aligned to your DAW's grid. If you start and stop to go find elements, that will just take a little bit of extra time to deal with. It's not a huge deal, but doing it in one continuous take is easiest, and having scene chain makes that even easier. The other thing that I highly recommend you do is have every instrument part play twice in a row, and then grab the second one. That way, everything will loop as cleanly as possible, especially if you have a sound with kind of a long tail. Like for instance, this synth part. That rings out a bit, and the very last note of that pattern is going to bleed into the first note of the second playthrough of that pattern when it repeats. If you just took the original pattern the first time it plays and looped it continuously, the last note of that pattern would get cut off abruptly, and it might sound a little bad. So what I would recommend doing is recording the synth part twice, taking the second playthrough of that, and then looping that, and that should loop very cleanly. When you're doing this, you can also think ahead in terms of arrangement and do stuff like lift a filter cutoff slowly over time, and maybe let the synth part loop a few times as the filter cutoff lifts, and then have it be at one static position for the rest of the song. Stuff like that, you have quite a bit of freedom here. But if you're trying to harvest individual parts, there's an even easier way that Roland recently added, and I'll get into that in a second, but that's going to require us getting some background first. In this next section, we're going to use looper tracks, not only to be kind of a workaround to export individual instrument parts as WAV files, but also to actually get more tracks on the MC-101 itself using a new feature in the 1.7 update. So first of all, let's make sure that we have a looper track free. So that does require a little bit of thinking ahead and limiting yourself, but only temporarily. Here's the beat I've got so far. Simple little deep house groove. I've got my looper track here. First of all, I'm going to hit shift and then record. I'm going to scroll over until I get to record source and make sure that's set to mix out. That means it's going to record the internal mix of the MC-101. Then I'm going to make sure I only have the tracks playing that I want to capture into this looper track. In this case, just the bass line. Now all I have to do is select an empty clip, hit record, and then hit play. Now, all of that is living on that looper track. So now, I could just change these tracks out for something else if I wanted to. For one thing, I've combined that stuff into this track. Or, I could take this a step farther using the new feature in the 1.7 update and hit Shift, Sound, go to Export Clip, and it will automatically export that clip onto the SD card as a WAV file. That I can either just bring into my DAW directly. I can just pop the SD card out of here, put it in my computer, go from there, which is super convenient. That kind of reminds me of stuff that the Electribe or the OP1 do, which is really nice to see in here. Or I could take this even farther. Let me just select a random drum that I'm not using, hit shift, hit the pad, go all the way over to WAV file, and then go into the new export folder. And now I can pull that up. So now, that entire thing is living in the drum track. You'll notice it's fading out a bit. If you want to make it not do that, hit Shift, Sound, and you can go over to change how it's sustaining. So in my case, I only want to hear it when I hold it down. Now, all of that can live on one drum track, and I can keep doing this. Now, I could make some new clips for these tracks that have different instrument parts on them, resample them into the looper track, export that, and also bring it into the drum track. And in fact, I've done that in a duplicate of this project where I took this approach way too far. For instance, I've got this other bass layer that I can use. And I recorded this extra synth layer. And an octave up version of that extra bass, all just living in this drum track. So if I want to hold all this stuff down, I can just do this. Watch this. All of that on one track. And you are restricted a bit with that, of course, because you can't export the individual pads of a drum track over USB, unfortunately. So that all gets baked into the mix. But the advantage that this has is in a live setting, you can maximize layers by doing this technique. And of course, all of these exist as WAV files that I can just directly pull off the SD card like I mentioned earlier. And you can always combine layers and then just pull them into one looper track. So you've got a bunch of stuff going all on one looper track, or even have different looper clips that have different combinations of elements, which is extremely powerful. Or if you really want to go crazy, you can actually load these resampled sounds into synth tracks as well. I should mention Roland also added a couple of other features in the 1.7 update that I'm not going to dive into here. They added a count-in and some updated stuff for the scatter, among other things. Once again, I'm not going to get into that in this video, but I am really glad to see that Roland is continuing to keep this device updated, continuing to make it more powerful, and keeping it relatively user-friendly in the process. If you'd like to see an example of the jamming process in action, you might want to check out this video up over here. And if you'd like to see how I mixed and mastered that in post, you can click or tap down over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.